friends, the topic of today's discussion is cinema historical sources in Rajasthan. And as all of us are aware that how cinema has definitely played an important role in terms of propagating so many ideas. And in the context of history, we can say that how cinema has also been studied from the point of view of an academic discipline in various universities of India, and how connections between history and cinema, they have been talked about by some of the scholars, those who may be called as film historians or film scholars. They have not only talked about the evolution and the development and history of cinema, but they have also talked about that how the other events, whether from the economic or from the political and cultural point of view, can also be seen in the framework of history. And when we tend to understand all these kinds of aspects within the framework of one of the regions of India called Rajasthan, so many films they have been shot in Rajasthan because of its scenic beauty, because of the kinds of monuments which are available in Rajasthan, and the culture of Rajasthan has also been shown in many of these films. So today we will talk about the various kinds of connections between cinema and history, and how the kind of sources they can be used in the framework of communicating the kind of ideas which are there in cinema as well as in history. Various kinds of genres of films which have been made in the recent times as well, whether in the framework of historicals or semi-historicals, and we will try to frame them, or we will try to put them in the perspective of many of the films which have been either shot in Rajasthan, or they have been borrowing some of the aspects which are related to that state, which is very rich in culture. And when you talk about the kind of readings which one can refer, then one can see Mark Ferro film as an agent, product and source of history in the Journal of Contemporary History, Peresol in Film and History, Restaging Past, Mark Ferro Cinema in History, Rita Monidas and Dr. Debashri Prasad Nath, Rudali in Film Narrative Looking Through Feminist Lens, then KRM Short edited feature film as history. So these are some of the books which one can refer, some of the readings which one can refer in the framework of understanding cinema, and how cinema is trying to communicate some of the arts aspects which are related to the day-to-day affairs as well. And when you talk about that how cinema is not only in that sense a subject matter, in that sense the films which are being shown, how they can also be sources of history, how they can communicate about the past, the important developments which happened in the past, and how it is also cultural agent of change, in the sense that when films they are trying to narrate the kind of changes which are happening in the society at different points of time. And these kinds of changes they get reflected in the films of that society, and how we see that cinema has also been seen in the framework of the mirror of society. So from that point of view, we find that it has been a very powerful means of communication, and when viewers they see films, they are definitely influenced by that kind of a cinema. And many times we also see that the issue of brand placements could also be seen in the films, that how advertisers they are putting their brands in the film, so that the audience which is seeing the films they also get influenced by those brands. So in that sense, when we talk about the kinds of ideas which are there in the films, and the various kinds of themes or the undercurrents in the films, how they were being influenced and shaped by the socio-cultural, economic and the political forces of those times. And cinema definitely is a part and a parcel of some kind of a general cultural pattern in that sense. And when you talk about the talkies which were there, which were made at that point of time, they were loaded with the songs, dances and the music. And when you talk about the various kinds of earlier performing arts in India, they were also full of music and dance. So when you talk about films, we also find that the other performing arts of India, how they were also very popular with the masses, because they were communicating with the masses in their own language. And in that context, when we find that the various kinds of forms like Jatra, which is a form of itinerant theatre, that was borrowing tales from the epics, mythology, and the folk stories of those times, and they all definitely had some kind of an objective to present a reformist, social or religious kind of a message, which was very popular in Bengal during the 18th and the 19th century. So we find that all these kinds of genres, all these kinds of variants or forms of the popular theatre in those times, they were very, very popular. And how people or the masses, they communicated or they in a way connected with these kinds of forms, that was also very phenomenal in that sense, that they were trying to communicate a lot of meanings through these art forms. And then we find that other kinds of forms like Katputli and Khayal in Rajasthan, Bhavai in Gujarat and Rajasthan, then thereafter Nautanki in Uttar Pradesh, Tamasha in Maharashtra, Leela in Orissa, Swang in Punjab, Yakshagan in Karnataka, Kathakali in Kerala, where we find the itinerant groups or the troops, they move from place to place to present their shows. So this kind of presentation of shows was a very important and relevant kind of an aspect in those times, and we find that how cinema definitely plays an important role in the society, that how it influences the beliefs and the fashions and the food habits of the people, and how the various kinds of merchandise which are shown in cinema, they are also being purchased by the masses. So in that sense, the kind of impact which creates on the society and how it is also characteristic is to collectively fascinate, excite and influence a large number of people. So cinema in that sense is very important, that how it is able to fascinate and excite and influence a large number of people. And when these people they watch those films or that cinema and how that is being shown on the screen, then definitely they get influenced by it. And when you talk about some of the novels etc. which have been written, and how these novels, they have not been read by all the masses, but the films which have been based on the novels, they have been watched by these masses, and masses, they have been influenced by such kind of films. And when you talk about some of the popular novels, where we find that the Tamas of Bhisham Sahani, which was based on the partition events, and how during this particular period we find that when Tamas was made in 1980s, and it was shown as a teleseries as well, and it was liked by so many people, and it was trying to communicate the ideas which were written by Bhisham Sahani in the novel of the same name. So what we basically see is that such kind of novels, as you can see on the screen as well, that how the Devdas of Sharat Chandra Chatterjee or Duvidha and Paheli, which were the films which were based on Vijay Dandetha's folk tale. So we find that these kinds of folk tales, which were not even read by the people, they became popular because the films, they were based on them, and such kind of films, they were watched by the audience. As I told you regarding Devdas, that how this novel which was written by Sharat Chandra Chatterjee was made into a film in Bengali as well as in Hindi in 1935, and thereafter in 1955 we find that Bimal Roy again made this into a film, and in 2000 AD we find that this was again made into a film by Sanjay Leela Bhansali with Madhuri Dixit and Shah Rukh Khan, and we find that it was again, in a way, the story was shown in a different manner in a film called Dev D, which was some kind of a adaptation, seeing the times in which we are living, the contemporary times. So all such kinds of novels. One was also Train to Pakistan by Khushwant Singh, which was again dealing with the issues of partition of India. So we find that in that particular novel also, when it was being adapted into a film, then so many people, they could watch that particular film and they could understand that what actually was there in the novel. So how cinema and literature, they are in a way interacting or with each other in that sense, and how cinema is trying to take something out of the literature and trying to present it in its own manner. So such kind of things could also be seen in the films which have been made over a period of time. Another such kind of adaptation was Pinjar, as well, which was again dealing with the issue of partition. And then we find that in many of the films, Rajasthan is not only some kind of a backdrop in which films are shot, but we also find that how they are trying to reflect the Rajasthani culture, the society, and the heritage. So, which is also being shown in these films, it is quite evident. So in that way, on the one hand, we find that films, they are dealing with the chivalry and the courage of the Rajputs, and then loyalty of their subordinates, colorful costumes, and the amazing scenes of deserts, grandiose palaces and havelis, and rich traditional food, etc. They are also being made, and they are being shown in the films. So in that sense, we find that such kind of cinema has also been very, very relevant and important, and we find that in films, not only Rajasthani culture and heritage is being shown, but at the same time the characteristics which are there in the people, and the kind of characteristics which have been exhibited by them at different points of time, they have also been reflected in that kind of cinema. And Rajasthan being a place where we find the colorful costumes and the kind of deserts which are there in Rajasthan. And Rajasthan is also very popular in the framework of the kinds of havelis and the palaces, which and many of them, they have been now converted into the heritage hotels as well. And we find that such kind of a portrayal of the Rajasthani culture in many of the films has taken the culture to the masses, not only in India, but in other parts of the world, as we find that films, they have this kind of a unique quality, that they are not any region specific, but they are watched by people across the world. And with the coming of the OTT platforms, we find that so many platforms which are available to the masses, and because of which films from different generations and different languages are available to its audience in their own mobile phones, and so because of which they are able to connect with these films. So we find that how many of the films which are dealing with the ideas of poverty and the superstitions of people, they have also been made. And they also try to reflect the kind of gender discrimination which is there in the society, then the feudal caste and the class violence which is there, and the exploitation and the helplessness of the underprivileged is also being shown. So we find that cinema is not only trying to show only one aspect, but it is also trying to show the varied kinds of aspects which are there in the society. So in that context, some of the negative things, they are also being shown in the films in the framework of the gender discrimination which is there in the society, or for that matter the feudal caste and the class violence which is there. So all these kinds of issues which are negative in nature and how they have to be rectified in the society, such kind of concerns, they have been reflected in many of the films of the films which have been made in different points of time. When you talk about the various kinds of scholars, those who have tried to see films, we find that Mark Farrow treats film as both a source as well as the agent of history. And as a source of history, the film is portraying the relationship with the societies that produce and consume it, and also the social processes which are involved in the making, as you can see on the screen as well. And as an agent of history, the film depicts and promotes the particular values, principles and attitudes in given cultures. So we find that cinema in that sense is not only trying to communicate that it should be treated in the framework of being the source of history, because it is trying to also show that it is also an agent of history. And in that sense, they are trying to promote the various kinds of values, principles and attitudes in the given cultures as well. So this is also happening within the framework of the films, and how films basically, and the scholars, those who are trying to study those films, including Mark Farrow and others, Peter Solden for that matter, or Guston Roberts, all of them, they are trying to say that how cinema is closely related to the society, and the various kinds of aspects which are being shown in the films, they have been taken from the society, and they have a very close relation with the society in that sense. And in that context, some scholars, they have also communicated that when you talk about the task of historian, that if historians are trying to neglect the audiovisual material which is available with them, that material will exist in spite of them as a history through the pictures. And furthermore, we also find that the public will also lose interest in the specialists, and specialists will also be in a curiously divided position, conducting their research or search shut away in the libraries, but turning to the television when they want information on present. So Peresolin has argued that the task of historian should be seen in that context, that they have to also focus on the audiovisual material which is available to them, whether they try to look for the sources in that material or they do not try to look in the context of the material in them. So we also find that once they are not paying attention to such kind of sources, then public will also not pay attention to them. And the specialists, they have to move with the times. They don't just have to go to the libraries and the archives to look for the sources, but they also have to think beyond them, and they have to look because they are turning to television when they are looking for news or some kind of information. So in that sense, they have to look for the audiovisual sources as well. And how, when they will have this kind of an interest in the audiovisual work, then they will not become schizophrenics, as Solden has argued, and then he will not be rejected, or she will not be rejected as a historian, as some sort of a representative of an outmoded erudition. So scholars, they have talked from that particular framework. They have also argued that the kind of things which a historian should do so that he is relevant in the society as a social being. And scholars like Gaston Roberts, he has talked about the relation between history and cinema, and he has commented that like history, cinema also takes past events as its subject, and filmmakers, by making films on these facts and the events of the past, they are more or less doing the similar kind of a work of a historian. That means that he is also drawing his own conclusions which are based on his own thinking and analysis of facts. So we find that scholars like Roberts, they have very clear ideas about the relations between the cinema and history, and how cinema and history, both of them, they are very relevant, because both of them, they are looking at the past events. And by this they are also arguing that how a historian has to draw some kind of a conclusion from the work which he has done. Similar is the work of a filmmaker, that how a filmmaker has also to give some kind of a climax or some kind of a conclusion based on the film which he has made. So in the context of that, Roberts has argued that only difference is that for a filmmaker, his film is a complete work for him, while for a historian it is a factual raw material. So in the context of a historian, any kind of a source material is some sort of a raw material for him, and with that raw material he is trying to make some kind of a history, because he is trying to interpret the kind of sources which are available with him. And for a filmmaker, his work is complete for him in that sense. And when is trying to understand cinema, we also have to see that it is very, very important to scrutinize the narrative of the film, as well as the sets and the language as well, and the relations between the films and the extra filmic. By that we mean the author, the production, the reviews, and the public and the state, those who are not directly taking part in the film. So they have also to be understood in that particular framework. And they also understand not only the work, but also the reality the work is trying to represent. And the various kinds of symbols which are there in the films, they are also very culture specific. We just cannot say that those kinds of symbols, they have some kind of a meaning which is very specific to that kind of society which is there. So we have to realize that how films, they are not only about dialogues, but they are also about symbols. And these symbols definitely play an important role in terms of communicating the meanings and ideas which are there in those particular films. And when you talk about the innate character of this document of history, which is cinema, which is a manifestation of the technology as well, so we find that historians' acquaintance is very limited in that sense, and this also causes some kind of a problem when historians are not acquainted with cinema, or the kind of technological part with which they are not very comfortable. So we find that many times in their efforts to study films, the historians, they do not have any kind of difficulty with regard to the accuracy and the adequacy of their methods or their deductions. So they are comparatively more clear in that sense, because the way they are trying to approach their methods. But many times we find that there is a kind of a desire to maintain the identity of the discipline, and it overshadows the effectiveness of the focusing on the question of historical meaning alone. And it is highly surprising that there is a talk of the oral history but not of audiovisual history. So the people, those who are in the field of history and cinema, many of them, they will definitely are going to argue that we are focusing on the oral history, we are talking about the oral history, but we are not, in a way, not focusing on the audiovisual history, which is comparatively more recorded in nature. So focus should also be on the audiovisual history as well. And we also find that it is also true in that sense that the events of the past, which become the subject matter for a historian, are an objective reality. But in determining the implements for the selection of the facts and their analysis, the subjectivity of the historian is a deciding factor. So the two aspects of the character of history, that is objective and the subjective, are linked to each other. They cannot be separated in that sense, and the objectivity in history is not absolute but relative in nature. And when historians, they are trying to interpret certain facts, which are the objective facts, then they are also providing their own subjectivity to those facts, because they are trying to interpret from their own standpoint. As E.H. Carr has also in a way argued that the people or the historians, those who are there, they have their own position, they have their ideological position and their upbringing and their context, and because of which we find that because of which they are also in a way they have their own subjectivities, and these kinds of subjectivities are being reflected in their ideas. So we find that when you talk about the commitment of a historian and the impact of the society on him, then it also determines his viewpoint and the approach towards the sources of history. So in that sense, in the ordinary sense also, we find that the mentality, nature, thinking, interest and the habits of a historian, they play an important role in his subject selection, research, analysis and writing. So in that sense, when one is talking about a historian and his approach towards the sources of history, then definitely we will find that the mentality of the historian, his thinking ability or his interest or his habits, all of them, they are definitely going to play an important role in the subject selection as well as the research analysis and the writing as well. So such historians, those who have their own kinds of ideas, and when these kinds of ideas they become, or they are trying to crystallize them in a certain manner, then we realize then it is very, very important from their subjective point of view, from their own ideas, that how their thinking or their interests, they are going to affect them in their perception, in their interpretation of the various facts of history. So we will try to talk about many other films which have been made in Rajasthan and how they have been very relevant or important from the point of view of in terms of presenting the ideas which are concerning Rajasthan, as well as we will also try to talk about the relation between the history as well as cinema in the next lecture. So till then, thank you very much.